Hello? Is the mic on? Yes. Hello. Welcome. Hello and welcome to our event today on lessons for the future governance of financial assistance in the EU. I have the great pleasure to host today this panel debate, which will be preceded by a presentation by Randall Hanning, who is Professor of International Economic Relations at the School of International Service at the American University in Washington. And Randall has been working intensively in the last few years on a book that got published in Oxford University Press. And the idea of today's event is to have Randall talk about this book, which is really about the experience that we all lived through of financial assistance in the euro area with the very complicated governance. So the book is called Tangled Governance, and really talks about all these different institutions that have been involved in the financial assistance here in a number of countries of the Eurozone. So Randall's presentation is on the record. It's being live streamed in public. But once he comes back and sits here, we will turn to a panel debate among the four of us here sitting here, which is off the record under Chatham House rules. And that debate will be introduced and will be a debate between Servaas de Roze. Servaas de Roze is the Deputy Director General of DG ECFIN, and many of you probably know that he has been the first head of mission of the European Commission in Greece, so very deeply involved in the topic of financial assistance in the Eurozone. And of course, Rolf Strauch, who's a member of the management board at the ESM, the European Stability Mechanism, and the chief economist of the ESM at the same time. And he, of course, has also been extremely closely involved in all the financial assistance programs that we have been observing in the last years, and continues to be involved in the discussion on Greece. That is, of course, as you know, ongoing. Tomorrow there's another Eurogroup discussing the Greek topic. Now, you may note that we do not have the IMF in this group, but sort of, Randall, you are the American, so we let you speak also about what you think the IMF's role is in all of this, and I will, of course, be chairing then the panel debate. Let me add a last word. I sort of have to apologize that we are an all-male panel, which we really don't want to do usually, but it sort of came about also as a result of sort of the institutional setup, I have to say. But in any case, we try hard to avoid all-male panels usually, but this time it turned out this way. So thank you so much to all of you for being here. After the panel debate, we will open up so that you all get a chance to ask one or two questions, so that we have a proper debate also with the audience. But again, once Randall comes back to the seat here, we treat it off the record, and the live stream is being switched off, and you can only use it under Chatham House rule, what you learn here. So without much further ado, thank you to all of you, and thank you, Randall, for coming. Randall, the floor is yours.
Guntram, thank you so much. I really appreciate you convening us in this way and hosting this event. I'm pleased to present here at Bruegel. Among other reasons, Bruegel has hosted me on a number of visits to Brussels during the research phase of this book project. Bruegel's imprint is also on this book through its kind of outstanding body of publications, which are cited here, including the study on the Troika programs that you all did here, which was published in 2013 by Guntram, André Sapir, and Jean Pisoni-Ferry. I'm also grateful to Servaas and to Rolf for discussing the book, and I much look forward to their remarks. This arrangement reminds me of an incident at a staff meeting of the institute that I was embedded in for many years. One of the senior members of the staff had recently joined the institute, having arrived from government, but had been incompletely or insufficiently socialized into the ethos of a think tank. And when his paper came up for discussion at staff meeting, he became increasingly agitated as the discussion went on. And finally, one of my favorite colleagues at the institute intervened and said, you don't understand, right? It is a privilege to be selected for scrutiny and criticism in this way. And indeed, it was, right? And indeed, right, it is today to the kind of the focus of this discussion. So let me begin with a couple of words about the book and my motivation for the project. The title of the book is Tangled Governance, International Regime Complexity, the Troika, and the Euro Crisis. There are many books on the Euro crisis. Some of them, as I've mentioned, have been written by people here even, but I claim to differentiate this book from others by its focus on the institutional questions. It addresses the workings of the Troika, the International Monetary Fund, the European Commission, and the European Central Bank. I recognize, right, that the institutional arrangements kind of go beyond these three institutions and include the European Stability Mechanism, the SSM at the ECB, and the Eurogroup and the Council system. So the use of the word Troika in this title is something of a concession to the popular discourse in the market and more broadly. So the book focuses on the conflict and cooperation among the institutions of this whole set, which I call a complex. So earlier in my career, I worked on European monetary integration. I have at the outset, and I remain a consistent supporter of this movement. I think I have to say that, especially now, given the current state of American politics and policy. When EMU seemed to be a little bit boring, however, about 10 to 15 years ago, I shifted temporarily to study the Asian regional arrangements and their interaction with the International Monetary Fund. But when the sovereign debt crisis broke, this crisis became the most compelling case of interaction between the regional and global institutions in international finance, and perhaps across the full range of issue areas. So as a study of regime complexity, which is an increasing focus in studies of international relations and international political economy, this is the indispensable kind of set of cases. So I'll speak for a total of 30 minutes. I'll stick to this, I promise. But as a warning, I might have to skip through a couple of the slides in order to meet this time limit. So my agenda is both positive, explanatory, and normative. The book kind of addresses five main questions, right? What explains the institutional form of the financial rescues in Europe? Why, in particular, did European governments choose to include the International Monetary Fund in the rescues and create the Troika? Right? Secondly, how are the conflicts among the institutions resolved? It's not at all surprising that there would be conflicts among the institutions. That was actually quite predictable at the outset. What's interesting is how these conflicts are reconciled. And third, how do states strategize their way through institutional complexity, right? Why did European creditor countries, Germany in particular, insist on including an institution that often advocated substantive positions to which it was opposed, right? What explains the coexistence, fourthly, what explains the coexistence of cooperation and competition within the Troika? And why doesn't substantive conflict among them lead to an abandonment of the IMF and a disintegration of the Troika as the institutional form in which these programs were addressed? So finally, should the euro area create a full-fledged European monetary fund and under what circumstances would that be desirable? I'll address these and then finish with a couple of words about the deliberations at the International Monetary Fund over the guidelines for programs in countries that are part of currency unions. So in my previous presentations of this book, I've learned that there's a danger that I could run out of time at the end, and as an adjustment to that contingency, I will give you the conclusions up front. Okay, the cost of this is that they might be insufficiently contextualized and seem a little bit abstract, but the advantage is that none of the main conclusions are going to be dropped. So, the first conclusion is that European countries, and key creditor states in particular, right, included the IMF in the rescue packages because their preferences diverged from those of the Commission. Regime complexity, in other words, is the result of states' strategy to control agency drift, the tendency for institutions to migrate away from the preferences of of an important group of members. Conflicting preferences among the member states and decision-making by unanimity lie behind the resistance to relying exclusively, right, on the Commission in this context. By construction, right, I think that the Commission has a little bit of difficulty serving primarily creditors in this constellation of institutions. And third, the institutions, I find, occasionally reach impasses over program design, right? And at those key junctures, right, the key states mediate the deadlock, right? Sometimes it's a small group of creditors, sometimes it's Germany, sometimes it's the G7, but the key states will play an important role in mediating the deadlock, and in so doing, they place their thumb on the scale, right? So interinstitutional conflict is integral to the mechanism by which these states influence the outcomes. So this explains, in my view, why states such as Germany insist on including the IMF even when it advocates positions averse to some of their preferences, right? And why institutional conflict has not led to an expulsion of the fund and the demise of the Troika. Right? Now, with respect to creating the European Monetary Fund, I think this would indeed be desirable. But I add an important caveat, right? This requires much more than marrying analytical capacity to financial facilities. It also requires a paradigm shift toward qualified majority voting and thus deeper political integration. Right? The political prospects for this are considerably better than I would have thought maybe 12 months ago, right? But the prospects still ultimately are unclear to me. Okay, so that's the overview of the fundamental argument. The study uses as its analytical framework the emerging work on regime complexity in international relations and international political economy. There, a regime complex is simply a set of international institutions that operate in a common issuary and the informal mechanisms that coordinate them. Actually, this definition is somewhat idiosyncratic to myself. It's different from some of the other authors in this literature in that, in my conceptualization, a complex is not fragmented by definition. And I set it up that way so we can study the differences between fragmented and cohesive regime complexes. Now, I have when I present this sorry, there's the definition. When I present this work to other audiences, I do so against the background of these basic indicators of financial stress in the markets, in the bond markets in particular. This is a set of charts that's, I think, pretty familiar to this audience. It is probably the set of charts that you see most often in this literature on the euro crisis. So I'm not going to take you through an elaborated description of this, except to highlight, perhaps in the last slide, that for most of the countries that have had programs, we see renewed growth and renewed access to financial markets. But the outlier, tragically, is Greece on the downside. So the reason, right, that I want to explain IMF inclusion is that I see it as something of a puzzle, right? Because Europe was the richest of the regions in the world. It had the financial resources to address the crisis. It had more economists per square kilometer than any other region of the world, and more people who had served in the International Monetary Fund and were now serving in finance ministries, central banks, and European institutions than any other region in the world. And it had been more than a quarter century since any member of the Monetary Union had drawn on the fund. And in that period of time, there were 4 programs to 3 countries in which the European Union lent directly without co-financing from the IMF. So one should be forgiven, an outsider should be forgiven for thinking that Europe would insist on prosecuting the euro crisis on its own without the help and support of outsiders, right? But of course, this wasn't the case. The IMF did come in over the opposition, right, of a number of people in the winter of 2010, right? So I like to quote all of these familiar faces on this question. One of my favorites is Jean-Claude Juncker, right? This would be absurd to bring in the International Monetary Fund. Another favorite is Christine Lagarde, who 15 months before she herself becomes managing director, is distinctly negative about including the International Monetary Fund in the crisis. So why, despite this predilection, this against including the fund, do we see it ultimately included? Well, there are 2 sides to answering this question. First is the demand side, right? On the European side of the equation, why did European leaders reverse themselves? The other is the question of what I call supply. Why did the rest of the world accede to the use of the IMF in this way? And I'll talk mostly about the European side, the demand side, but we can have a discussion about the supply side if you wish. And the short answer on the demand side, but it's too short of an answer, of course, is that the German chancellor wanted the IMF in over the objections of her finance minister. But this is a little too short, and we need to look at her underlying political situation to address this. So this is my depiction of the Troika arrangements. It's not a physical representation of the negotiating tables, of course. It is a conceptual depiction of the negotiations. It suggests 3 takeaways that I'd like to emphasize. First is that the Council and the Eurogroup are also integrally involved in decision-making on these programs. The negotiations have more than 2 sides, really. It's a multi-sided set of negotiation. And the member states stand behind the institutions, and some of the key creditor states are better placed than others in this constellation. Germany and France, for example, have entree in all of the creditor institutions around the bargaining table in various ways, right? So the book conducts a structured comparison of the 7 programs in the euro crisis, and these are reviewed in the table here. The cases in the book are developed by any means necessary, that is to say, looking at original documents, looking at secondary documents, and was about 250 interviews that I conducted over the course of the last 4 years. And each program has its own chapter, more or less, in the book. For the sake of time, I won't go into details on these, except to highlight a couple things by way of overview. the inclusion of the IMF is contested in each case, right? So it's not this case that the inclusion of the fund was decided in the spring of 2010, and this template was simply replicated automatically over the course of the crisis, right? The possible exception here is Ireland. The second point is that the relative financial contribution of the International Monetary Fund declines from 2012 onward, and that the Spanish program and at least the first half, first two-thirds of the third Greek program, right, are the odd men out, right? The IMF does not provide financing in these cases, but does shape kind of the conditions and monitors implementation of these programs, right? Now, they, at the outset of the crisis, Euro area leaders kind of offer a number of reasons for including the IMF in the program, right? And those are that the IMF brings financial resources that are, and supplements those that are available in Europe, that it has expertise and credibility in designing and negotiating programs, that the IMF provides some protection against political backlash against austerity in program countries that's useful for the creditors and the European institutions. The fund kind of shares the political responsibility for this. And these are openly acknowledged. A little more sotto voce is their unwillingness to rely so completely on the Commission. But what's interesting about as we go through these programs, right, is that the rationale that seemed compelling at the outset, right, fade when subjected to the test of the subsequent programs. So by the spring of 2013, certainly, right, the European machinery had created a financial facility of its own in the form of the ESM after using the other facilities temporarily, right? So this is no longer a compelling explanation for why the IMF is still involved, right? The European machinery also marshals the technical staff and expertise, albeit spread out among the Commission, the ESM, and the ECB. It has also conflicted with some of the key member states, or let me say, in some of the key program capitals, right? The IMF is known to be, quote unquote, on the right side of the debate among the Troika institutions. In Dublin, right, the mission chief is A.J. Chopra is popular because of the position that he's known to take. And this is no doubt at a personal level gratifying for people at the IMF that are used to being demonized in program capitals around the world for their programs. But the point is that makes the fund useless as the protection against backlash and as a scapegoat in these programs, right? So that's no longer a particularly compelling explanation either, right? And it's also true that the IMF has conflicted with several of the creditor states on the fiscal glide path, private sector involvement, and even official sector involvement, which reduces, right, but doesn't fully eliminate their kind of affinity for the fund relative to the other European institutions. Yet the choice kind of remains to include kind of the IMF in the programs. And kind of this is true today still with the third Greek program. And I identify as fundamentally underlying this preference a substantive disagreement among the European governments, which I call preference heterogeneity, combined with intergovernmentalism, right, the key element of which is unanimity, right? Decisions on programs, right, loan disbursements, and financial facilities require unanimous approval of member states with the involvement of parliaments in some countries. The wariness of exclusive reliance on the Commission remains important, but this stems from its mandate, the Commission's mandate, to advance the interests of the Union as a whole, right, in the context of conflicting state preferences. So this diagnosis, right, of what the fundamental underlying causes of the involvement of the fund, this is important because it leads to an expectation, right, that as long as Euro area member states take decisions on financial assistance to sovereigns by unanimity, at least one key member is likely to request IMF participation in crisis resolution. The Spanish program and the first half of the third Greek program could be a template for future programs, but complete exclusion of the IMF from a sovereign rescue while unanimity remains in place would be surprising from this standpoint. Now, Table 2 is a more careful kind of analysis of each on a program-by-program basis. But I have to be brief. And I want to underscore this argument about strategizing complexity before going on to talk about the EMF and the IMF protocols briefly. So by gathering several institutions to address the crisis, and the choice of the institutional mix is made by member states ultimately, governments use them to check one another, right? This is a time-honored strategy in the domestic sphere, right, by which political scientists have analyzed in comparative politics, right, by which, for example, the U.S. Congress controls executive agencies, and even, say, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union controlled the Soviet bureaucracies, right? Governments elevate this strategy to the international level with the euro crisis, albeit this was not the first time. The strategy can be shockingly inefficient sometimes as conflicts arise, but efficiency ultimately, from the standpoint of these member states, takes a backseat to control, right? And this kind of institutional conflict is essential to the control mechanism. So there are several instances of mediation which we could kind of talk about in detail, where the mediating role of key states turns out to be pivotal. And I think this continues. This goes back to the first Greek program and continues at various points along the way through up to the current program, as a matter of fact, right? I'm going to be brief there. This is my conceptual depiction as to why it would be in the interest of a key state to include the third institution. By doing so, it restricts the zone of possible agreement to an area which is closer to its preferences than would otherwise kind of be the case. Now, should Europe create a European Monetary Fund? Right? So my conclusion, my answer to this question is that yes, indeed, it would be good for Europe. It would be good for the United States and the rest of the world. I think it would be welcomed outside of the European Union. There are a number of proposals that would combine the personnel and financial resources of the European Stability Mechanism and the Commission, either under or outside the aegis of the European Treaty framework. But this study, right, in this book, teaches, as I've said, that more is required than simply combining these two elements, bureaucratic capacity and financial resources. Difficult as doing that might be. So establishing an EMF that is trusted as an agent by the creditors and at the same time secures the acquiescence of the rest of the group is more difficult. For this institution to be effective, Euro area member states would have to surrender their vetoes over financial assistance. And this would be necessary for jettisoning the International Monetary Fund from crisis programs in the future. right? Of course, these would be tantamount to deeper political integration. And even if there might be grounds for optimism for forward progress after these elections in the middle of this year are over, the next crisis, a prudent planner, right, would expect that the next crisis could arrive before this architectural advancement is completed. So, despite controversy surrounding the Troika, cooperation, I expect, in one form or another among the 5 institutions, while contentious, right, is likely to continue. So at least as far as the demand side from Europe is concerned. So supply, as I say, is another matter. And on the supply side, we come to the question as to how the IMF would approach the prospect of lending again to a member of the monetary union, be it the euro area or another monetary union. What guidelines or policies should it adopt? 5 minutes? Easily. What guidelines or policies should it adopt for a contingency like this? So these questions anticipate kind of the reviews that the fund is now conducting on regional financial arrangements, a review on lending into currency unions, and a review on expanding the toolkit of financial windows and lending facilities. These 3 are linked, but of course the one on lending into currency unions are most kind of focuses on the questions that we discussed today. My book doesn't offer hard answers to these questions, but for the sake of stimulating kind of our discussion today, I want to highlight kind of 4 considerations that are almost certainly going to arise in this context. So first, the IMF is likely to seek kind of reliable assurances on the part of the Eurogroup with respect to euro area-wide policies that are critical to the success of a program. Over the last few years, right, agreement on banking union, right, was essential to bringing the crisis to an end as a euro area-wide phenomenon. And I think that non-Europeans were right to ask for this as something to accompany the involvement of the IMF. These assurances are easier to get from governments than they are from monetary authorities, however, right? A useful distinction, I think, could be drawn as far as monetary authorities are concerned between central bank actions that are country-specific, which might legitimately qualify for the agreements in the Troika, and policies that are union-wide, kind of like monetary policy. On the latter, policies that are union-wide, informal assurances are probably the path forward, right? But these assurances would have to be credible at the same time, and making them informal and credible is a difficult circle to square. So secondly, members of the currency union are going to be asked to acknowledge the preferred creditor status of the IMF. And I find this increasingly questioned, actually, in some discussions that I have in Europe, and I would be happy to come back to this in discussion. And third, the region is almost certainly going to be asked to provide some method of debt relief in cases where debt is unsustainable. And most important of all, I think there is going to be a stipulation about effective governance in the region that can deliver decisions within the time frame that fighting crisis requires. There are 2 circumstances that will constitute red flags for the International Monetary Fund. By red flag, I mean a warning sign, right? First, when key actors use the crisis itself as leverage to extract concessions from one another, this is deeply problematic, and this was actually the case by my reading, especially in the early years of the euro crisis. The second red flag is where threats to withdraw or expel a member from the monetary union are part of the negotiations over a program. Right? Governance isn't working. when parties resort to these tactics, and the possibility that the crisis could worsen after fund involvement rather than improve rises when they do. Now, this sounds like a list of demands, right? It sounds exigeant, but they are fundamentally, I want you to see that these are all fundamentally supportive of the integration process in a currency union, in the euro area specifically. And in that sense, is consistent with the agenda of many here for deeper European integration. So in closing, I'm going to highlight two observations. The first is that, perhaps ironically, by creating a European Monetary Fund, European member states could facilitate the involvement of the IMF in future crises by establishing some of the conditions by which the IMF would be comfortable participating. Okay, the discourse about the European Monetary Fund is often premised on it being exclusive of IMF involvement, but this is not necessarily the case. The second observation is that if, to the contrary, the European Monetary Fund obviates member states borrowing from the International Monetary Fund in practice or in principle, the meaning of membership in the IMF would come into question, right? And this would resurrect, in turn, the issue of joint membership in the fund for all euro area countries, right? And this, I think, is missing from the current discourse over the European Monetary Fund, but would almost certainly be a consequence, at least the raising of the issue, would almost certainly be a consequence of the creation of an EMF. And I think Europeans and non-Europeans alike will confront these larger issues if proposals for an EMF go forward. So thank you for your attention and your indulgence, and I look forward to the discussion.
Well, thank you, Randy, for this very good overview of, I have to say, a very complex topic, and of course a very big and all-encompassing book. So I now very much look forward to our discussion under